right, well, hi everyone. Welcome to this very special panel on disability and horror, Beyond the Freak Show, with panelists Ariel Baska and Rabia Sitabi. So let me just introduce you to both panelists first. Rabia Sitabi is an expert public speaker on pop culture, tech developments, POC rights, Asian entertainment culture, LGBTQIA+ rights, and tech safety for POC and LGBTQIA+ people, as well as a host, moderator, and programmer for film festivals and literary events. Her identity as a queer disabled Asian African woman who was born in Europe gives her the unique position to be at the crossroads of different identities and cultures and how to understand them. In addition, her marketing consultancy, Our Pish, is well known for digital strategies, culture marketing, and data-driven solutions in entertainment, tech, and culture. She is the co-host of Ride the Omnibus podcast and the Cultural Curators podcast, both of which rely on her expertise as a pop culture expert. Thank you, Rabia, for being here. And then next is Ariel Baska, who is an openly disabled horror and documentary filmmaker. As a former teacher, she is deeply interested in film's potential to shape the future. Her horror short about medical gaslighting, Our First Priority, which she wrote, directed, and kickstarted, premiered at Final Girls Berlin in February. Yes, we're very happy to have it. She is also in production on a documentary feature about medical bias, The Doctor Will See You Now, and she is attached as producer on several projects, Mike Mignola, Drawing Monsters, a documentary about the creator of Hellboy, Our Voices Carry, the story of two female journalists an ocean apart, Latasha Harlins, a biopic of a noted social activist, and Liftoff, an animated feature from Signing Animation, a study of deaf and hearing impaired animators. She is the founder, co-host, and executive producer of Ride the Omnibus, a podcast parked at the intersection of pop culture and social justice. She writes about disability representation for her column in Ghouls Magazine, where she regularly contributes film reviews and analysis. She's a published author of 4 textbooks in the field of education and seeks to elevate marginalized voices in her work as a writer, podcaster, and filmmaker. Yes. All right, take it away.
Sorry, thank you. First of all, I just want to say how delighted I am to be here with Final Girls Berlin, who were the first to champion my film about medical gaslighting, which is, which actually just won the Disability Advocacy Award from Superfest Disability Film Festival as well. But Rabia and I are both delighted to give this presentation because of our identities as women with disabilities, as well as our placement within the horror genre in general. Rabia, would you like to kind of say a little about your disability identity, or?
Yeah, sure. Just to quickly, amazing intro, by the way, by Eleanor. Thank you for that. My pronouns are she, her. For the people only listening, I am a very caramel burned Asian African, North African woman. And I'm wearing glasses and I have a hairband on and my hair is slicked back and I'm wearing a t-shirt and I'm very, very happy to be part of this talk because Ariel and I talk a lot about disability in connection to film and horror, particularly. I'm a big horror fan. I have several what they call non-visible disabilities, and that causes for some issues in daily life through ableism. As well as that, on top of that, I'm neurodivergent, I'm on the spectrum, and unfortunately have lived through some trauma in my life. So I also deal with mental health issues. And that combination with all of my intersectionalities, so with all my identities combined, brings that for some reason I latch onto horror more than other genres, hence being part of this talk. How about you, Ariel?
Yeah, so my pronouns are also she, her, and I am a pleasantly plump blonde woman in a blue top. And I have a lot of non-visible disabilities as well as marginally visible disabilities. I'm visually impaired, hard of hearing, I have chronic migraines. I have various neurological impairments that chronic conditions have contributed to over the years. And so for me, the horror genre is both a place where I can sort of celebrate my differences, but also respond to the traumas that I've also experienced in my life, as Rabia said earlier. And so just so you know, the presentation we're about to give is going to focus primarily on disability identity in Malignant, Fresh, and Titane, but we wanted to give a little bit of a quick survey of disability and horror that is very Euro and US centric. Yeah, unfortunately, while there are a lot of really, really great films that talk about disability in Asian cinema as well, because the three films that we chose to talk about primarily are US and French films, we stayed with a Euro-US centric approach in this presentation, but we're going to go through this extremely quickly, so I hope you're ready.
And quick as a side note, both Ariel and myself are actually really, really big horror nerds when it comes to this, specifically when it comes to international horror. So this happens to be a focus on the more Western centric films. But in general, if you ask us for recommendations, we'll more than likely give you Asian titles.
Absolutely. And also, just so you know, I've only mentioned the first in the franchise generally, with films that are that have many different iterations. So just so you know, it's not that they don't exist, and it's not that I don't recognize them as wonderful films, but you kind of get the point. All right, so the title of this is Beyond the Freak Show. And so I thought I would start kind of with Joseph Merrick, the Elephant Man. This photograph that's on the left was taken in 1887, shortly before he died in 1890, which is about when the decline in Europe of the freak show tradition started happening. It wasn't entirely because of the existence of Joseph Merrick, AKA the Elephant Man. He was immortalized in the film by David Lynch in 1980, but even though this is not a horror film, it is still an important representation of disability on screen. And historically, Joseph Merrick is one of the reasons why disability became regarded in a different kind of a way. For the first time, people actually saw the autobiography of someone who was a part of freak shows and who actually rose to a certain amount of prominence in society and was regarded as being intellectual. And there was suddenly a move away from the freak show and everything that it had represented, both because of the politics at the time, but then also disability politics became a bit of a thing suddenly in Victorian England, where it hadn't been before. Now, this is not to say that freak shows did not survive and thrive in America, which they definitely did. But this was sort of the start of where you see freak shows and deformity and disability shifting into the zeitgeist in film. Because of photography and film, you have lots of representations of deformity and disability, from the Phantom of the Opera, the Hunchback of Notre Dame, the Man Who Laughs, which incidentally may have been the inspiration for the character of Joker, obviously. Yeah. Frankenstein by James Whale is a character who obviously is also from Victorian literature originally, but is considered to be, as portrayed in the films, a character who embodies both intellectual disabilities as well as deformity, whereas in the book, there is no sense of intellectual disability at all.
Yeah. And in a way, Frankenstein, you can even consider him being on the spectrum, right? Because he has like sensory issues, and he gets overwhelmed in the movie, and that causes him to lash out because there's no understanding how he cannot deal with a mob just screaming at him, basically.
And the sensitivity to light and to fire.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then you have Mad Love, which came out in 1935, specifically about a man with prosthetic hands that try to, kill and murder. Then we have Freaks from 1932, which is particularly important in the history of disability representation in cinema for a number of reasons. First of all, this is the first time that a majority disabled cast was included on the set of a Hollywood film. And the whole story behind this film is a very dramatic one, but what's fascinating to me is that there have been very, very few portrayals on screen that had authentic portraits of disability in the same way that this one did.
Infamously so, though, because that's the way that this movie was made, and in the era that this movie was made, they were still not seen as complete members of society and full-fledged members of, the human race in general. But it did give them it gave us a look into those who were basically seen as outcasts, who were either vilified or othered, in such an extreme way that they had no other choice than to be part of the freak shows that were happening back then.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And like the Elephant Man, Joseph Merrick, these are people who voluntarily decided to be a part of the freak show as sort of their own way to escape the tragedy of their circumstances as a whole. But then you have more representations of people with temporary disabilities coming into the fore, with Rear Window by Alfred Hitchcock, which features a man who is temporarily immobilized after injuring his leg. But you've also got, coming from France at the same time, allegories for war with Eyes Without a Face, where you have a young woman who is severely disfigured and a father who voluntarily tries to graft other people's faces onto her face as well. Whatever Happened to Baby Jane is another one that's often categorized as hagsploitation, but is actually really phenomenal disability representation as well. Joan Crawford is featured in a wheelchair throughout this film. Again, not authentic representation, but still important in terms of looking at kind of the politics of how her wheelchair is used against her in the course of this movie. The horror, of course, most people remember as coming primarily from Bette Davis, however, and not the wheelchair, thank goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Wait Until Dark featured Audrey Hepburn as a blind woman. The Cat O' Nine Tails is one of a few movies by Dario Argento that featured Carl Malden as the blind character. Suspiria also featured a blind character getting mauled to death by a dog. Yay. Twisted Nerve is notable because it is one of the worst representations of disability on screen for political correctness, shall we say. Twisted Nerve is one where a young man, because he has a brother with Down syndrome, apparently is driven to psychosis and to killing. And this is one of those representations of intellectual disabilities that a lot of people have had to kind of work against in kind of the socio-cultural context. It's not the only one, but it is one of the first ones. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which features our buddy there, who almost everybody hates in this movie. I don't know if you had opinions on his character, Rabia.
He was not my favorite.
Yeah. So
yeah, no, definitely. And to be honest, before I had better knowledge and awareness about how disability was represented in horror movies or in movies in general. Before I looked at it through a more aware lens when I was younger, I did not even focus on it too much. I was like, oh, this is an annoying character, but okay, like, you know, how are people being slashed up, and what is happening to the final girl at the end, because she straight up has a psychosis by the time that she ends up spoilers. It's a movie from almost 50 years old, but still, spoiler alert. One girl makes it out and she goes batshit insane, basically. So while she leaves, yeah. It's interesting. Yeah.
It is. And what's also interesting is that the Texas Chainsaw Massacre features Leatherface, who is the first of many villains that we see, particularly in the 70s and 80s, who are implied to have intellectual disabilities because of incest, potentially, in their heritage.
Yeah.
And so Leatherface is the first of those. And so that's why this movie is actually on here for two different reasons. You also have The Hills Have Eyes, which again features someone who presumably has intellectual disabilities, but also seems to be very bent on the concept of rape as a replacement for affection he's never known, which again, you see in I Spit on Your Grave. And you also see that in Friday the 13th as well, where the motivation for Jason killing these sex-starved teenagers is supposedly because, you know, of something he possibly never had.
Yeah, from Friday the 13th, the second movie onwards. Yeah, and it's especially interesting to see that in all these movies, the villain is the person that has some type of disability going on, or has, you know, either a physical or mental or a combination of both going on, and they're immediately villainized. But it's because of their disability that they're doing this stuff. For some reason, that is their main drive, their main motivation. They have been, you know, they live with this situation, and that makes them the villain. Jason has, you know, his physical disability going on, that gives him the intellectual disability, and that's why he becomes eventually a killer. Because, well, it's a little more complicated than that, because obviously his mom gets killed in the first movie. So again, spoiler. I'm giving away spoilers for really old movies here, but his mom is the killer in the first movie, and she gets killed. And then, as it shows in this little still over here, you see Jason pop out of the water, and he's not really dead all this time. So, but still, there's this immediate, like, oh, because he's like, what back in the days they would say like harsh things like he's wrong in the head, right? Like those types of terminology, which nowadays I can't even fathom that you would say that about a person. But back in the days, that was that. They were like, oh, someone is wrong and quote unquote wrong in the head. That's why they're doing like that. That's why they have socially unacceptable behavior. And that was really the trend back then in the 70s and in the 80s.
Yeah, and also just as a quick note, we haven't really talked about people who have straight up psychosis in this presentation, just because the classification of psychosis based on, you know, you're murdering people, etc., is a very common theme in all the slasher movies, but we're focusing now primarily on things that have to do with intellectual disabilities, etc., like The House on Sorority Row, which is another slasher that plays on that trope as well. Now, A Nightmare on Elm Street is kind of a throwback to, you know, the Phantom of the Opera and the Hunchback of Notre Dame, this idea of the kind of disfigured character with who is sort of coded to have disabilities in general. But obviously, Dream Warriors and Freddy's Dead are the two that specifically talk about assistive devices, where Freddy turns medical assistive devices into, in Dream Warriors, kind of a Spanish Inquisition style wheelchair, because the wheelchair is the prison, obviously, which is not a very politically correct way to look at kind of the history of assistive devices. And then in Freddy's Dead, a hearing aid is turned against the deaf character. In Silver Bullet, however, by Stephen King, you have a more empowering vision of the wheelchair, as the silver bullet is actually like a much more interesting representation of a mobility device.
Yeah.
Monkey Shines is George Romero's step backward from that. You can even see on the poster, it says, once there was a man whose prison was a chair. So that gives you a sense of kind of where the cultural leanings toward disability were at the time.
Yeah, and the problem what you see back then, and still to a certain extent right now, is that if someone has a very clear visible disability or something that they can portray either through a chair or other assistive devices or something that they can visually portray, then often that became the only personality trait of said character. They would not have a lot of body to them, pun intended.
Exactly.
Because that their whole being was encapsulated by just being disabled, and which obviously is like the worst way to portray someone with a disability, because we're full human beings. Sure, I can't walk to the end of the street, but I have personality. I have a personality, very outspoken one. I have hobbies and thoughts, and there's a lot more happening with me as a person than just not being able to, walk to the end of the street. So that's well, we'll jump into that further along when we go to our three main titles, but especially with, if you look at an image like this, it really pulls you back, and like how they viewed visibility back in those days. It was like, oh, that's the only thing that you can be as a person, which is a reflection of society as well. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, of course, absolutely. Yeah. And in the case of Pet Sematary, the character of Zelda with spina bifida was another notable example. Edward Scissorhands is, not someone that you typically think of as being a disability or horror movie portrayal necessarily, but it is important because he is one of the first that we see on film to have prosthetics used as weapons. Which is a theme that we're going to start to see from 1990 onward. Misery in 1990, another Stephen King title about a man whose temporary injury leaves him disabled and unable to care for himself. So the caretaker is where the horror comes from here. Candyman, another prosthetic used as weaponry. Obviously, this is a really important piece of horror, both for the fact that for the first time, you have a character with a disability who is also Black. Amazing. For US cinema at the time, what's important to note is that almost all portrayals of disability were generally white men and white women. And so more primarily white men. And so when you see this start to crop up in horror is where there's a little bit more commentary that can be made.
Yeah. And what's so important or so signifying for Candyman is that it started its own modern mythology for Black Americans, which prior to that was harder to find because they were obviously stripped from their culture in a large part. And this movie brought in modern cinema a new line of mythology that was particular to this particular group of people. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And continuing on the idea of prosthesis as weaponry as Army of Darkness from Sam Raimi, going into the realm of actors with disabilities on screen is Leprechaun, starring Warwick Davis. Because he himself has dwarfism, Leprechaun is sort of the one place in horror film that he's actually appeared. And the Leprechaun franchise is something that people are still arguing about quite significantly in the disability community today, whether or not actors should take on the role of Leprechaun if they restart the franchise is a heated debate. There are people who feel that any portrayal, anything that gives an actor work from the LP community or little people community is really important. Whereas other people feel like that we need to move on from this. This is not a valuable slice of representation.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And then just to put it in perspective, to compare that, I mean, it would be the same comparison as saying like, oh, Indian people finally getting representational roles in movies, but then being cast as a taxi driver. Is that something we still want or not? And that's obviously for the community itself to discuss and decide about.
and then copycat in 1995 is Sigourney Weaver as a woman with agoraphobia who has a mental health condition that prevents her from leaving her apartment. Also starring Sigourney Weaver, we have Alien Resurrection, where you have an amazing wheelchair. I want this steampunk wheelchair in Alien
Yes.
Resurrection.
Yes.
Unbreakable with Mr. Glass, also in a wheelchair. Land of the Dead features someone who, surprisingly, again, spoilers for something that's a little older, but one of the things that is kind of remarkable about Land of the Dead is it's the first time that you see someone with intellectual disabilities as well as physical deformity who survives to the end. That almost never happens in horror, but it does in this film, which is wonderful. Planet Terror, Rose McGowan has another prosthesis that is weaponry. Then starting in 2016, you suddenly get a huge glut of representations of disability on screen in horror. In Don't Breathe, you have a blind man who is both victim and villain, which is part of the theme of today's films that we're going through as well. In Hush, you have a deaf woman who's terrorized in her own home. Split, you have a really, really terrible representation of dissociative identity disorder. People can debate however they want to about the merits of such representations, but from a disability community standpoint, this was not a great representation. Gerald's Game portrays a character with acromegaly as a villain. Get Out features Stephen Root as the blind man. This character, I would argue, is really, really great for saying a lot of things about the disability community in one character. One of the constant complaints that I hear from my friends who are Black about the disability community is that it doesn't seem to care that much about other communities in the DEI framework, because there's always this feeling of like, well, I'm disabled, I'm oppressed, therefore no one else is oppressed in the same way that I am.
Mm-hmm.
And in the same way, you have a character with disabilities who is totally okay with commodifying Chris to literally steal his eyesight.
Yeah. No, exactly. And again, like it's part of identities, right? Like you and I have several identities. Obviously, I'm a brown woman, so there are different layers to my identity that you do not experience. However, you have identities that I do not experience. So there's different ways and things to identities, and it's there's a lot. If you're marginalized, it always sucks to be marginalized, doesn't matter to which group you belong to, but yeah, there are definitely layers into that. And Get Out in general is just, oh my gosh, this movie did so much for me. And I'm not even a Black American, but as a brown woman, this movie did so much for me.
Yeah.
Mm.
And you also have something like The Shape of Water, which, some people try to connect the creature from the Black Lagoon to disability. I didn't want to get into talking about explicit monsters as related to disability that are not humanoid. But by creating the character that Sally Hawkins plays as a mute woman in the shape of water, there's another sort of exploration of disability and identity. A Quiet Place in 2018 is also kind of a major jumping off point for deaf characters in the world of horror as well. John Krasinski created something where explicitly American Sign Language is used as a life-saving piece of knowledge. And so from there, we wanted to kind of give you a brief survey so that you have a sense of where things have been in the US Eurocentric lens before getting into a discussion of disability identity in Malignant, Fresh, and Titane. Because we feel that these films particularly look at the lens of both victim and villain within the world of disability. So we'll start with Malignant.
Yes, and that's a double whammy because again, spoilers will for all of these movies, just to go ahead, if you have not seen them, prepare to hear spoilers or listen back to this, watch this back in another moment. But we have to go into spoiler territory to be able to really discuss why these movies are relevant for this talk. So with Malignant, I'm gonna go straight in with the spoiler because I'm gonna give someone a 5-second pause here, but here we go. The main character is both the protagonist and the antagonist. They're both the victim and the villain in this. And that has to do because, back to you, Ariel.
This has to do with the fact that Gabriel, the antagonist, is actually a dead twin that is on the back of, or I'm sorry, not dead twin, but a second skeleton on the back of her head. And so this is something that is used in this horror movie, particularly, to talk about both her as a member of kind of the deformed class of disability protagonists, but also an antagonist who suffers from the existence of this twin.
Yeah, and you see very clearly in Malignant. So they're basically conjoined twins. I don't know if that's the right terminology, but he is the beta. Basically, he's the less prominent physical twin of the two. So she has the main body. It's mainly her where he is attached to the back of her brain. So they do share some brain space. And it's interesting to see how that brings both physical disability and then a lot of mental disability or psychological disability with it as well, because she is literally feeling as if, her mind is being taken over, and almost in a literal sense it's happening, but she doesn't know that. So she's living in this projected world that is keeping her like encapsulated in this fantasy where she is being kept dumb by her twin, basically, while the twin uses the body and goes out and commits all kinds of crimes and heinous acts because they're angry. Gabriel basically is angry. They're aggressive, they're angry, they want to be part of the world, they're angry that they don't have their own full body. So at least that's my interpretation of it. And that anger, it, explodes into aggressiveness and into trying to basically punish everyone who did not help them become a whole person.
Yeah. And one thing that really struck me about this film, I actually, true confession, I only watched this film very recently because Rabia insisted I do it because she really wanted to be incorporating this film into this talk. But it took me a lengthy conversation to understand how powerful this film is as a metaphor for non-visible disabilities because of the way that brain fog can literally take over your body in a way that is not evident to other people, and that there is this hidden thing within you that can turn against you at any moment and trick you into thinking whatever it wants to trick you into thinking.
Yeah. And then on top of that, all of this is happening. She feels something is wrong, but no one believes her, at first glance. And that's that ableism, that pushback. If you have non-visible disabilities, of people going like, oh, you don't look like you have or something wrong with you, or we don't feel that you have something wrong with you. And that frustration that builds because there's a lot happening with her physically, and just people just keep writing it off or pushing it off like, oh yeah, sure, it's something, it's in your head, which I mean, in the movie it is literally in her head. But also metaphorically, like, they're pushing it as, and it is in your head. It just full disclosure, Malignant is not one of my favorite movies, to be honest. It's very campy. It's not the best made movie by James Wan, but particularly for this particular topic, I was like, yeah, I feel that we need to incorporate this because this is a recent movie. It has both the topic of the villain being someone who has a disability, as well as the victim being someone with a disability, which kind of calls back to the old trope of the, like, oh, someone has a disability, deformity, something going on, so they must be the villain. And then but then it puts a twist on it where the victim, or the victim in this case, the protagonist, has a non-visible disability going on, but at the same time she's not the tropey person that is her whole personality. So there's like more layers to it, I guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's actually that aspect to this film, because her disability is hidden by kind of the storytelling. It's interesting that she is allowed to flourish as a more complete protagonist for this very reason.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, no, I agree.
So speaking of, and so this is an image of the conjoined twin coming out of her back as well, in the sort of flashback scientific sequences.
Yeah.
But then
Okay.
we come,
Oh, sorry. I wanted to mention one more thing, because there's this amazing scene in the movie where basically the conjoined twin like twists her body backwards so that he can use it and do all kinds of things with it. And then she wakes up and she's like, why does my body feel so broken? Why is it so tired? And I'm like, that's how I feel. Sometimes that's how I feel. Like, did someone take a walk with my body? Why do I wake up so fucking like I walked a marathon? I can't even walk a marathon, but my body feels like I did. So in a way, I was like, oh yeah, I feel this. I mean, I feel it in a different way, but I feel this.
Mm-hmm. And it's kind of an interesting thing, because we don't even know if James Wan actually did this deliberately, but there are so many individual lines from within the film that, as members of the disability community, really resonated with each of us in different ways.
Yeah.
And so if you look through the script, there are so many things that particularly comment on kind of chronic illness and invisible disabilities, non-visible disabilities, sorry.
Yeah.
Now, fresh is another one where you have a consideration given to the victim and the villain with disabilities. Now, at first blush, you might be looking at these images and saying, I don't see anybody with disabilities in here. I saw this film with a friend recently who was like, why are you writing about this for your disability and horror column? But Anne Kemp, again, spoilers, who is the wife of Steve, played by Sebastian Stan, is not only a former victim of his who has a limb difference. She's missing the lower part of her leg. But she is also a killer who wants to kind of keep the status quo with this meat market of young, fresh women for this shadowy underground organization that she presumably wants to take over at the end of the film. And one of the things that's really fascinating about this film is that the women who eventually overcome at the end of the film are all disabled in other ways themselves. They've had, their butt removed, their breasts removed, their legs removed, but they are able to overcome, and they are never defined specifically by their disability differences within the course of the film.
Indeed, indeed. I think it's also very interesting that because she's one of the antagonists, as you mentioned, but she's a former victim. She was there, like she got Stockholmed into it in up to a point that now she's like, you know what, I'm going to be part of this system that suppresses me, and I'm going to help with the suppression, which is obviously like a very interesting way to look at it. Like, will you fight it and get your place and get your representation and your acknowledgement and respect, or do you become part of the problem, which is what she eventually chose to do. And it's again, it's amazing that she then does not become defined by her disability, but she comes defined by the choices that she makes to be part of the villainy, basically, that has disabled her.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And one of the other things that's interesting about the image of her as a character is that she does not wear her disability on her sleeve. Even though she has a limb difference, she's very careful to conceal that and cover it up by wearing pants in every scene that she's in. It's only when we see her in the shower that we actually realize that she also has a disability. And one of the things that I think is fascinating about this is that I think it is a very deliberate attempt to kind of also comment on what happens when you have people who mask, who choose not to reveal their disability, and who choose not to disclose, and specifically make things harder for everyone else. The screenwriter specifically said that she was commenting on women who are a problem for other women, but it's also a problem within the disability community where people choose not to out themselves as a part of the disability community, and as a result make it harder for everyone else at the same time.
Yeah, and when we say make it harder, we mean like, have people be confronted with other people's disability. Because I feel that personally, when I mask, when I'm around people who are not disabled yet, as we would call it, or who don't have any, clear disabilities or awareness of their disabilities, when I mask, I do that not because I'm trying to hide who I am, but more because I'm afraid, for instance, for their ableism. I often, and I'm sure that's a lot of other people with disabilities as well, whether your neurodivergency comes into play or if it's any of your physical disabilities. The moment people realize that you have a disability or that you verbalize it, often they kind of like put you in a box. And especially when it comes to professional work that I do outside of interesting events like this, I kind of have to put that as like a secondary part of my identity, or like a tertiary part of my identity, because if I immediately from the get-go mention that I have a disability, I often don't get hired. I already have to deal with the fact that people have to look at the brown woman first and then get over that. So then disability creates this extra layer that you're like, okay, I'll mask it a little bit, and once it comes into conversation, I'll mention it. I won't hide it, but I will mask it up to a point that until people get to know me a little bit better and we're in a further stage of getting to know each other, I'll then let it out like, oh, hey, by the way, I'm dealing with this and this, or I'm a little sensitive for this, I'm going to sit in this darker corner, or hey, I can't walk to the end of the street, so just so you know, no walking for me, no stairs. But yeah, no, it's oh, almost forgot my point. My brain went into a whole lot of
it's this question of ableism of
yes.
like to mask or not to mask. Is it a sign of complicity when we choose to mask our identity as people with disabilities, or is it a sign of just fear of ableism. And obviously, in the case of this character, a lot of her villainy is about her complicity. And so
Definitely.
I have no problem saying that that is what is going on with this character.
Yes.
But obviously, as people with disability identities, there are situations in which we have to mask in order to get along.
Yeah. No, and thank you. You brought me back to my point. Yes. So, and then that's interesting indeed to see with her, because the only reason that she is masking indeed is to be complacent, but also to not have her attacker be confronted with what he did with creating her disability. So as long as he doesn't have to deal with the fact that she is disabled because of him, then she can stay in the picture and be part of the community. So it's not just only saying like, okay, I'm just going to pretend I'm not disabled, or I'm going to keep it out of his way, but also with this idea of like, oh, I can pretend to be one of you, even though I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And that's excellent. Now, our last film that we're going to be discussing is Titane from 2021, which is a film that I strongly identify with, not because I have been a transgender serial killer with a lot of other things going on.
You're not?
I'm not. I'm sorry. I didn't tell you, but I'm not. But I had a lot of brain trauma and brain surgeries as a child. And so the idea of this character who, from the very beginning of the film, experiences this traumatic event where a car crash happens and there is a brain injury that occurs, and the character chooses after the brain injury to make that a forefront part of her identity. This particular thing always reminds me, when I watch the film, of my insistence as a child that I didn't want laser surgery. I was actually born with half of my face blood red and purple, and I insisted that I didn't want to wear makeup. I didn't want laser surgery. I wanted to put it as full on display as I possibly could. And so the fact that this character does that right from the get-go and incorporates it into her hairstyle and so forth felt very freeing for me as disability representation, because so often we're taught to kind of be ashamed and to hide whatever we have that is different. But this being a part of this character, I mean, obviously she has lots of other traits as well that we'll get into in a moment, but there is kind of this automatic discussion within it of a different kind of disability portrayal in and of itself.
Yeah, I think Julia Ducournau is definitely an amazing writer for this age. I love the stuff that they did with Raw as well. And in Titane, it was very particular for me to see, because they really, really well portray the switch of the main character of being a kid, going through that car accident, coming out with a titanium plate in their head, and then switching from trying to get affection from their parents to actually getting affection from the car. And that mental switch that happens there, because now they have this titanium plate in their head, and it almost feels like a portrayal, like, oh, now I'm part titanium, I can now ask for affection from this thing is now living because I am living, and I have this in my body. And then when it moves to, there's so many switches in this film. For me, I had to watch it twice. Very, very honestly, have to say that the first time that I watched it, I was like kind of meh about it. And it wasn't until the second viewing, where I really gave it my time and attention, that I really got more into it. And that was more so also because there's just so many things that happen in different layers with this character. And she's not a good guy. But they're not a good guy. They're not the bad guy either, but they're not a good guy. And it was hard for me to find that little bit of connection to go like, okay, I kind of feel for this person in this way. Whereas some of the characters throughout, because further in, and the second adoptive father, basically the fireman, that was an interesting story. Basically the story flips once they change their gender identity. And there, oh, my mind is going all over the place. I'm so sorry.
Well,
But
maybe if I start by just saying, Julia Ducournau wrote it explicitly, wanting it to be written as, rather than a 3 or 5 act structure, rather that it should be written as a series of layers,
yeah,
instead of acts. And so it's the idea of a transformational process, and that there are all of these different layers that are either being applied or removed over the course of the film, I think is really fascinating from a disability perspective as well, because you have kind of the first layer of the traumatic relationship with the father, which is then, followed by, the embracing of the trauma of the metal, and embracing the actual metal substance itself as either an avatar for trauma, but also, a sexual partner. And one thing that really strikes me every time I watch this film is really the fact that when you look at how Titanium is portrayed throughout the film, whether she is actually humping the car, as in the still at the bottom of the screen, or whether she is murdering with her hairpin, it doesn't really matter, because she still feels connected to it.
Yeah. And how do you feel? Because there's so many layers to this movie, as you just mentioned. Because there's also this this sub layer of what is masculinity, what is femininity, and how does that connect to your identity as a person? How does that connect to the main character's identity, especially when they go through the different phases that they're going through? How did you see that, especially when it comes to their connection with the father, the second father, the fireman, and especially how that person also deals with different types of disabilities?
Yeah, so I find that this film is really fascinating. And by the way, I should also note that both Rabia and I identify as queer, as well as disabled women. And for me in particular, this is one of the first times I have seen any kind of denotation of queer identity in a film, any kind of film, within disability and within kind of gender reversals, et cetera. One thing that I think is done incredibly sensitively and well is this adaptation from the character in Titane, where she sort of transforms from being a villain into being a bit of a hero / victim of everything that is happening. She actually adopts this victimization identity, which seems so opposite to everything else, but is able to kind of give in to their own vulnerabilities by looking at the vulnerabilities of the adopted father figure. So where the original trauma of the film appears to be the relationship with the father at the very beginning, where the father won't pay attention to the child, here it seems to be that the father is only giving attention, and the vulnerability that comes through enhances both of the relationships.
Yeah. And it's that move, that flow from like a biological father being neglected, then finding some type of interest or love interest even in vehicles, in material like that has titanium in it, and then flowing to the adoptive father basically being this person that they then put their full trust in eventually, and then find this new form of affection with. It's really, really interesting how that flows goes, how that naturally it is, because by the time you get to the second part, as I would call it, where they've changed their identity, their gender identity, even though they are going through a pregnancy still, you almost forget that in the first 30-45 minutes of the film they brutally mass murdered a whole bunch of people, because there's such a big contrast between who they are before they go to the change and who they are after that change, and how willing they are to go with the flow and become this person that this father who is so hopeless, otherwise, to become this support system for them, to become this reason to stay alive, to keep going.
And it's that intersection of sexuality, disability, and trauma in this particular film that I think makes it particularly rife for discussion, even though it is not one that is typically considered necessarily within the horror canon. I would argue it absolutely belongs, due to a lot of segments of body horror that made everyone around me visibly squirm in their seat. Interestingly, it's the father's self-injections that made people squirm the most in the screenings I went to, which again says something interesting about disability as well. But.
Yeah, because it's a portrayal of something that people normally don't get to see. Whereas flashing people up, that you find that's what you expect in a horror movie, right? But seeing a medical procedure done by a person who's clearly, not completely capable of performing that act themselves, seeing them struggle through that act, and even at one point having to ask help, that uncomfortableness that comes with it when you feel that as a not non-disabled person, or not yet disabled person, it really, really shows like, oh, okay, you've not been confronted with this before as well. Whereas a lot of people who have physical disabilities and have had to go through painful procedures, or having to inject yourself, or having to put pills and other medications in places, it kind of feels like, oh yeah, this is very painful to watch, but at the same time so very, very familiar.
It is. And so these are, three films that we wanted to discuss specifically because of this dichotomy of victimhood and villainhood. But we wanted to know if you have any questions for us. I know there are a lot of comments in the chat that we have not been following, but
I saw some comments on people of recognizing and the disabilities and being spoonies as well.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks again for this wonderful presentation, and thank you also for sharing your experience the way you did. I think it really benefited this presentation and just generally really enriched everything. Yeah, so now's the time for questions, so please bring them on. I can start off. I really love this historical overview was great, and some of the films were more sensitive to the topic, some of course less. And I was just wondering if there's some horror tropes that you're just like completely done with in terms of disability representation. Like, are there things you're just not able to put up with anymore?
Oh yeah, definitely. So what I mentioned before is the trope of, oh, someone has a disability or something, like a marginalized identity, and that's their whole personality. So, oh, this person is blind and that's all they can be. They're not a person otherwise, and everything they do has to do with their blindness. They can't be a person apart from that. I think that's the one trope that still really irks me. And unfortunately, it still happens, not as often and as much as it used to, but it's not completely wiped from the horror landscape yet, unfortunately.
And I would also say, like, people with disabilities who are perfect victims is something that I really want to see go away. Like, I think perfect victims are not interesting anyway to begin with, but particularly within the disability community, I think I'm really sick of seeing people who are particularly into playing martyrs to a cause in some sense. One of the things that I really like about Fresh particularly is that I've wanted to see smart disabled serial killers as much as possible. And so that's the trope I want people to start using, because I think that's important. Anyway.
Yeah. And apart from tropes, something in general that I just feel is missing in the media landscape in any type of film, and also horror film in this case, is that the background, when you look at extras, they're never really like disabled people in there. They're always like, well, wait, no, let me reiterate that. There's no one with physical, visible disabilities in the background. Or if you have like side characters or main characters, and if they have not visible disabilities, that get voiced and becomes part of their character. So for instance, I'm neurodivergent, I have sensitivity to certain things, I deal with mental health issues. I mean, I can still fight a fucking demon. I'm really good at looking up stuff in books, but I might get overwhelmed if there's too many lights. That could be part of the story in a way that without it becoming my whole personality. So yeah, that's something representation wise that I'm still really, really missing.
Yeah.
And actually, the most important trope that I forgot to mention is the trope of being motivated to kill by your disability explicitly, because your disability identity is not the only thing about you. And so this goes right back into Rabia's first point, but being motivated to kill because, you know, the world sucks and I'm disabled is a really terrible message for our times.
Right. Okay, we have some questions coming in. I'm curious about your reference to the protagonist of Titane as being trans, because I've read conflicting opinions about this. Do you read the film as actively seeking to portray a trans experience? If so, what would you say about this portrayal?
This is an interesting question. One thing that I think I take away from Titane specifically is that it plays with gender in so many different ways. I don't actually want to pigeonhole it specifically as depicting a trans experience. I really think it's very much about the performance of gender and the performance of all of these elements more than it is about necessarily going through a transgender experience necessarily. But I feel like there are so many different aspects and so many different layers to the film that I don't really have time to, like, I could write a dissertation about this film. But in general, I would say that it's more about the performance of a thing and the performance of who the character is and how they're represented than it is anything else.
Yeah, and let's also to add on to that, let's also not forget that being part of the transgender community does not only mean, transitioning from one gender to the other. Non-binaries and gender fluid people are also part of the transgender flag. So if however which way you interpret their gender fluidity in this movie, it still falls under the transgender banner in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, I'm not the person to do any final comments on that, because I'm not myself part of that particular community. My kids are, but still that does not give me advocacy, like the rights to make any final comments on that. But in general, if you look at what the transgender flags or banner stands for, and how non-binary and gender fluid people are also part of that community, then definitely Titane could be interpreted as such, being part of the transgender community, at least.
I have a question unrelated to this topic, so a bit of a jump, but I was wondering if either of you have seen the films of Crispin Glover. It's like not the films he acts in, but Crispin Hellion Glover as a director has made a few films with, or at least two films that had disabled cast members. One was the whole cast had Down syndrome, and then the other one, it was about a serial killer who has cerebral palsy.
Do you have any titles for me? I'm really bad with names sometimes, but
One of them
titles.
is called What Is It? And the other one is called, I think, It Is Good, It Is Fine, something like that. They're very hard to come by. I think they're like, he goes on a traveling roadshow with these films and doesn't distribute them in any other way. So I was wondering if you happen to have seen either one and if you have any
I
opinions.
have heard of them, weirdly enough, but I have not seen them, to be honest. Yeah.
I have not seen them either, unfortunately.
I hope I can somehow find a link that I can share with you.
Yes, please.
I would love that.
Yes.
And another question in this direction. Have you seen any of the films by Todd Solondz that have Down syndrome representation in them?
Yes.
I think in Palindromes, there's like a house of disabled, almost like a church, like a cult or something like this, like a sunshine cult that has disabled performers in it, in real life and in the film. And also, I think in the latest, like The Wiener Dog, or in one of his more recent films, there's also a couple of characters with Down syndrome. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about the role they play in the narrative, if you feel that their representations are reductive in any way, or if you find them I've been thinking about those films in particular, so I was wondering if you have thoughts on them.
Well, Todd Solondz, I think in general, I mean, even from when I first saw Welcome to the Dollhouse, I think there is kind of a simultaneously dark and sardonic approach to all the material, but then additionally in Palindromes, because of the lens that he views everything with, for all of his films, I think it's hard to take away a totally positive representation of disability from almost any of his films, but that is as much related to his tonality as it is related to necessarily what he's doing within the narrative structure. And so I think I would have to go back and rewatch both of those films to really comment on the narrative structure, but I know that it didn't feel right to me. It didn't sit right with me when I watched either of them. I can just comment on that.
I can say they also gave me pause in some way, but I know they're not horror films, so it's a bit out of the scope of this particular presentation.
Okay, we have questions coming in here. So another question about Titane. Do you think the main character is coded as neurodivergent?
Oh, that's interesting. Definitely, it kind of shows that they're. It seems almost as if they're on the spectrum. They're definitely not acting within quote unquote, like, normal societal accepted. How do you say that? Communication forms and such, like the way that they communicate and move about. But at the same time, I would find it very hard to say whether they are neurodivergent or not, because again, the spectrum is so wide and there's so many forms and ways to be on the spectrum. So it was not one of the first thoughts that came to my mind, to be honest.
I just wanted to add that I loved your reading of Frankenstein as being on the spectrum. I'm wearing my hat right now. This is the first time I've heard that particular take on this figure, and I found it to be super just true and compelling.
Yeah, no, for me it made a lot of sense because I'm light sensitive, and I I'm also really, really high sensitive when it comes to like a lot of people and loudness around me. And when I saw that in the old film, it was like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Like I wouldn't like people like, holding fire in my face and being loud and stuff. Like I wouldn't have a normal or like a socially accepted reaction to that either. Why would they expect that from him? So yeah.
Okay, we have a long question coming up here. Does the difference between positive and negative representation of disability in horror tend to come down to the difference between portraying disability itself as horrific versus portraying the marginalization of the disabled as a source of horror? Are there portrayals of disability as horror that don't come down to trapped in a chair type tropes? Is it possible to portray disability as horrific without misrepresenting the disabled?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if you have a particular take on it, Ariel.
I do, and I'll be honest. That's actually exactly what I'm trying to do in my films. I'm trying to, particularly with my first film, I very specifically tried to characterize what it feels like to be sound sensitive and light sensitive, and portray the horror of that, while at the same time making the horror come from an unexpected place. I think it's very hard for filmmakers who aren't disabled themselves to really properly portray disability as being horrific without reducing it to a stereotype. I think one thing that we are very much in need of is more filmmakers with disabilities in the forefront. And personally, I think that's going to come very soon, actually. I'm not the only one out there making this kind of work. I've met a lot of people, particularly in the last year at festivals, who are also doing the same thing. And I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done in this area.
Yeah. Oh, I love that answer. I have nothing to add to that. If you haven't seen Ariel's work yet, or haven't seen, medical horror in general, Final Girls did an amazing block during their festival. So please do support them and keep an eye on what they do, because they do give an amazing podium to makers such as Ariel, and others who do have amazing perspectives like that. And in general, follow Ariel, because she makes awesome work. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
Thank you. Sarah, do you want to take on Mars's question?
Sure. Okay, Mars Nikolai says, I think there's a long history of disability and transness overlapping in a negative way in film representation. Right now, I'm thinking specifically about the way the stigma against mental illness used to further the stigma of people presenting in gender nonconforming ways. For example, Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, as the abled and cis world often conflates the two as having to do with wrong bodies.
I love that question. Oh my God. Yeah, I mean, the idea of being in the wrong body that doesn't do the things that you want it to do, the idea of functionality, impairments as also being related to your expression of gender identity, I think is a really fascinating idea. I don't know that I have a lot to add to this, but Rabia?
No, I think it's laid out pretty well. I think another example would also be in Psycho, obviously, where he dresses up like his mom, which is not, the greatest way to portray, any gender fluidity, gender nonconformity, or transness. I think we're slowly finally moving to more trans representation in media, and not just in series as Pose, but Euphoria had a really good example, and I'm hoping to see more and more trans people, so people who have transitioned in whatever way, or are part of the trans banner in general, to be part of horror, not because they're trans, but because they're amazing actors and they have amazing stories to tell. So That's more what I would hope to move towards. And again, we're talking back to those tropes, right? Someone's identity or marginalization should not be their full personality, because that's not the same for cisgendered heterosexual people. So
yeah, I mean, I guess another question about something that you referred to a few times in your talk, this idea of like having temporary disability and how that's portrayed. I was wondering if you could maybe talk a bit about the difference in a way. Are there differences in the portrayal of temporary disability and chronic, disability?
Well,
yeah. Oh yeah, go ahead.
oh,
Sorry.
no, you go ahead.
No, go first. Go first.
Okay. So for me, like what I noticed in particular, like looking through kind of the history of disability in US centric horror, you notice that when it comes to temporary disability, there is this very focus on the banality of the disability itself. The disability itself is not played as like almost its own character in the way that it is in a lot of other films where there's chronic illness there. In Misery and Rear Window, the disability itself is a plot point. It's not, and it's a plot point that is expressed as if it's just an off the cuff side thing, as opposed to becoming a primary feature of that character or of the narrative thrust as a whole. And so that's one thing that I think in films that feature people who have these temporary disabilities, not that there's any difference in the amount of disability that you have, because the severity is different for everybody and the length of time is different for everybody, and people's disability statuses can change over time. But it's fascinating to me that within horror, there is this almost normality to temporary disability in exactly the way that it's expressed.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that. That was perfect. It's interesting. Now maybe one thing. It's interesting that again, coming back to tropes or plot points or how things are written from a someone who does not have disabilities or is not aware of disabilities perspective, is that often those temporary disabilities indeed are used as a weird plot point or something like a deus ex machina almost type of thing, where obviously for someone in their life, it's just not how they perceive that, whether it's temporary or chronic. It's an impact on your life, and it's, if it's used in a nice way, then I'd love to see it, but there's often not not the greatest portrayals of it. Yeah.
I just wanted to return to something you said at the very beginning, where you said that horror is a great place to celebrate difference. Actually, I think that's where I'm trying to find. Yeah, have a place to celebrate differences in general.
Yeah.
Do you feel like horror is like at the forefront of transgressive portrayals of disability versus other mediums and genres?
Yeah, definitely. I am, for me personally, I feel that horror is the closest thing to a reflection of zeitgeist and cultural and community of any given time than any other genre. If you look at horror back during, pivotal moments in history, horror was the first one to speak out on it, or to portray it, or to interpret it and portray it in film. And I think horror is also one of the more honest media, like genres in film, where people are less afraid to be experimental, to be more vocal, to be more expressive, to speak out, to claim their space. So yeah, I think then if there's a place that you want to see change happen, then the first step should be in horror as well.
And I would agree with that completely. And I would also add that if this presentation were about representations of disability in the media as a whole, I would generally say that anything not in horror generally falls into the classification of inspiration porn. There are very few portraits of people with disabilities that are not, look at how they struggle and overcome their disability. This is amazing. And literally the only characteristic or obstacle that people are given to overcome is the disability itself. For me, as a child growing up with deformity, I saw myself in Freddy Krueger when I was 2 years old. I looked at the portrait of Freddy Krueger and I was like, oh, that's me. I'm that. And it was the first time I saw something on screen that reflected how I felt about the world, because so much of media is so focused specifically and explicitly on making everything look good, candy colored, etc. I think horror is a superb place for actually exploring the darker sides to everything. And it's where you can look at almost any topic, warts and all, whether it is in disability portrayals or anything else.
Thank you for sharing that. And then I also want to return to another thing we talked about, I think, before we opened the room to guests, which is problematizing that binary between able-bodied and disabled. And rather, you were saying you like to use the term disabled and not yet disabled. So I don't want to just repeat what you said. I'd love to hear you share that again with
well, to set the fact to sketch a picture here first. 25% of the world as is right now has awareness of a disability, whether it be physical, mental, whether it is visible or not visible. But then at one point in your life, you will encounter something, especially as you grow older, that will put you eventually in the disability category. So hence, and that's Ariel came up with this, and I still think it's amazing, the not yet disabled term, because a quarter of the world is already there. We're already a really big community, and we're very, very much neglected worldwide. But then eventually the rest will catch up to us. So, right, Ariel?
Yeah, whether you want to or not, everyone will experience disability at some point in your life, unless you die young. I know that, it's not a glamorous statistic, but it's true. Aging comes with it a lot of infirmities and problems that nobody gets to escape.
Those are words to end on, I think. Yeah, so thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Rabia and Ariel, for this fantastic panel. And we have our last talk now, coming up at 9. May Santiago, who I believe is here, will give a talk on the monstrous feminine and political objection. So yes, be here if you like. And we also have a PayPal if you'd like to support us and what we're doing here, this brain binge experiment. Sarah, do you want to maybe quickly link it? Because I can't link it.
I did. I linked it already.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
And also, just in case you're in Berlin, we have an annual festival every February in person at City Kino Wedding. We'll try to keep virtual elements available as well. And
we have social media. Yeah.
Yeah, we have social media. I guess you already know about it if you're here, but spread it around to your friends. And at the end of the month, if you're in Berlin, we also have a screening in Neukölln, which we'll be advertising soon at the Backhaus on Weserstrasse. So that's all. We'll see you back here in a half hour. Thank you so much to Rabia and Ariel. That was amazing.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.
Bye-bye.